Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to New Wave Global. I'm your host, Rabia Mehmood. New Wave is an independent news site which looks at the world through a South Asian lens and relies on your feedback. Please do like, subscribe, comment, and engage with our work. We have a very special guest with us today, two special guests, but one is, if I'm allowed to say that, a guest. We have with us the senior fellow at the Belt and Road Caucus for Asia Pacific, BRICAP, Mr. John Peng. He has served in the Malaysian government, and he is also a senior research fellow at the Perak Academy, Malaysia. And then we have Ziyad Faisal, who is a writer and researcher on political economy, and he's also an editor with the Friday Times. What are we going to speak about today with these two gentlemen? Welcome to our podcast, first of all. We are going to be looking at primarily the role of China in the Middle East in achieving reconciliation when it comes to key issue, which is the Palestine question. But we would also be looking at what is happening in the human rights sector, because since October 7, 2023, one of the big question which has emerged since the unfortunate continuous bombing of Gaza, then like the attacks on the occupied Palestinian territories, and now Lebanon, and in fact Iran as well, and the bombing of Yemen, if you may, if we can include it, is that where does the human rights framework apply and where does it not apply when it comes to such violations? And some of the questions which have emerged are that whether the rule-based order is in danger or whether the rule-based order apply to certain countries or it does not. We are going to be speaking to our guests about this. And we're glad to be bringing this conversation to our viewers. If I can start with John, I have put forward, like, this is a very generic framing of what we want to speak about today. We can speak from October 7 onwards, we have seen repeatedly that there is a consensus that a genocide is taking place in Gaza. There is enough consensus built on that. I don't know of a single international human rights lawyer or an expert, people in fact who are experts on the Holocaust as well, not saying that this is not a genocide in Gaza. And yet there is starvation, there is hunger, there is violence every day. We're seeing this unfolding in HD, being live streamed on our phone as we speak. Just today, I was looking at a photo of number of children lying down as if they were sleeping, but they were all killed while they were sleeping in Gaza. This is just one example. And yet the world and the Western powers who have the most influence, not just on Israel, but generally, are unable to stop it. And in fact, are enabling and bankrolling what is happening in the Middle East. And yet you have some countries like China who have played a role in reconciliation through different means. How do you see that?
Rabia, thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be on your program. This is a very new context for me, this discussion. But the concern you just brought up, I think, is universal. It's indeed an extraordinary thing we've all experienced since October 7th. It's not only a clear case of genocide, it's a self-proclaimed and brazen act of genocide. So in the face of this, I think it shakes your very concepts. It shakes your sense of reality. And I think we've in one way or another all lived through that. So this is an enormous challenge to the usual moral framing around geopolitics. We've always known it was instrumental, it was, somewhat hypocritical, but the role of the West in this is not just in, not being able to stop the genocide or just enabling it, but it really is participatory. They are co-genocidaires, co-genociders, co-actors in this. It's very difficult to know what to make of this and how to make of this. And this language of the rules-based order that you mentioned is, long before this, people like myself had already said it's empty. Whose rules, whose order, who imposes this? It was really a cover for, it was a polite way of talking about hegemony, an assertion or an expectation of unipolarity. But now it's just a joke. It's actually an insult to one's intelligence to even give it credence. So, it's not as if I've struggled with this myself. We all know that international affairs are a bloody and ugly business. But a certain degree of deniability in this, just some measure of doubt, something not so brazen, not quite so brutal, not quite so live streamed, might have allowed us to sort of play along a little bit and not offend one another too much. But it's become an insult to one's dignity and intelligence to go along with the language, that this is someone's right to self-defense. So it's a true challenge in that respect, and we need to talk about that not just on a personal level, but also in terms of how we look at international relations and its moralization thus far in the
Yeah,
language of
and
human rights.
yes, in the language of human rights.
Yes,
So
yes.
sticking to that, because that's what a lot of people still understand who work on these issues. For instance, I've been a part of like the international human rights uh, sector, still affiliated with that in Pakistan and otherwise as well. And I know of some, and like we all know some really good people who are engaged in the what we call the human rights movement and this campaign for dignity, equality, and rights and justice, whatnot. And and you've been affiliated with the sector in various capacities, and you understand it. And somehow I feel like the entire sector is at the moment confronted with this issue where they understand that it's what they're doing is ineffective. I'm assuming they understand it, right? Because we have a report upon report upon report from the big rights organizations. We have like evidence. We have so much evidence, right? Not just what we are seeing, but it meets certain criterias, right? The carpet bombing, the white phosphorus being dropped on just Lebanon, for instance, in October and in November, and we have a very quick turnaround of reports now. And we've also moved on from like the word apartheid being used to occupation, the word occupation being used and whatnot, and the hashtags everywhere. And yet it's not moving forward for some reason. Everything, it appears to be that there is a dead end. I mean, that's how I look at it. Correct me if I'm wrong. So how do you see this? And then I would also want Ziyad to respond to this as well, because we've had these conversations offline a lot. Yes.
Thank you for taking the conversation in this direction, and it's a difficult one. The language and the discourse of human rights, we have come to take it, has become sort of naturalized for us. We've come to take it for granted as this being the only way to defend human dignity, welfare, life, however else you might characterize it. This is almost the only way we know how to talk about it. But it's important to remember that it's actually quite a recent way of talking about this. It's actually a post-war movement with a very definite history, coming out of the experience of the Second World War, but also related to a type of liberal project. In other words, it's related to the exact hegemony that we are seeing defend itself with such egregious, extraordinary brutality right now. So the language of human rights actually, it's actually a thinning down of or a cut down version, a liberalized version of what is actually in its actual intellectual history, a set of Christian ideas in the West. So before we talked about human rights, it's not as if people didn't have notions of justice, of the sanctity of life, and so on in our respective traditions, in Islam as well, right? In the Buddhist tradition. So these ideas are there articulated in different languages, but they come to be sort of described in this one single framing. And it then became progressively in the post-war period more and more an international regime, not just a language, not just a way of talking, but a set of institutions, including NGOs, but really not just NGOs, but international institutions that upheld these rights, established these rights, but somehow they were connected to a unipolar power. It was tied to American power. So that fact is coming to light. We call it hypocrisy, but it really is part of the system. Then you might say, okay, I need to defend myself. The language itself, it sounds noble. There are fundamental rights, but it does have its weaknesses. Those children in Gaza, they're dying, they're starving, they're dying of rights. They have so many human rights, they're dying of them, right? Because those rights mean nothing, have somehow come to mean nothing, because they got declared as human shields or whatever, or terrorists. So a simple flick of the switch, of the rhetorical switch, can turn this off. So we need something more than that. There are traditions in which you can't turn the rhetorical switch off. I don't want to get too philosophical here, but in our religious traditions, in Islam as well as in Christianity, you can't do that. These are children of God, no matter what you do. So you have a metaphysics behind this that is unshakable, that you cannot. So there are different ways. I'm just saying, I'm not advocating one or other of these traditions, but there are richer and other traditions that overlap sufficiently so that we don't particularly need just this hegemonic discourse, the single way of talking about our rights that so easily become weaponized and turned against people. I don't want to go to, we don't need to go too far into how everybody has seen how utterly hypocritical it is. Such that they are applied very, very specifically for certain instances, and it's tied to the language of democracy. So these become a way of asserting a kind of super sovereign power over everyone else, who can be said to not be democratic, to not defend human rights, and yet the most barbaric violation of those rights, to use that language, or the most barbaric cruelties or evil, to use other types of language, is being done completely under cover of this, or with human rights sort of standing by and just with its completely unable to do anything. So we do have a problem.
Yes.
Right. But we do, because of this problem, we do see the lines, we do see the genealogy of this language. We do see what it's allied to and related to. And I'm not saying you abandon the language of human rights altogether, but you have to realize that it's not just a language. It comes with a whole set of institutions, NGOs, etc., not all of which are standing by, for example, and saying no to what's going on right now.
Yeah. And also just, you were speaking about human shields, and I was thinking of collateral damage, something that
collateral damage, yeah.
Previously, as a result of Iraq war and whatnot, that people were just collateral damage in Afghanistan and whatnot. And now we have human shields and,
Yeah.
for instance, a child in Jenin, a child, literally a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old,
Yeah.
or in the West Bank, is targeted.
Yes.
Deliberately, and then there is this whole propaganda machine which establishes that they could be they could be perpetrators or terrorists.
Yes.
And then wait
Yes.
for an investigation by a Western publication or a Western institution which says and establishes with a very kind of like a tediously, meticulously done procedure and says, no, this was a
Yes.
child. And a child,
Yes.
9-year-old, 10-year-old, was not doing anything.
Yes.
And hence was,
Yes.
killed, and that was a violation, which was an extrajudicial killing in any way, even if it was not a child. But I mean, thinking of the same frameworks and of rights and criminal justice system. Anyway, so Ziad, now I'm going to come to you, and I have the same question for you. And not just the effectiveness of framework, but also the fact that we have this thing as a something which is universal, right? We're speaking about different traditions, and we, being from Pakistan as well, we speak about we have a domestic, law, constitution, and sometimes there are protections in those. They are guaranteed, and yet sometimes there aren't. So we speak about how to address these things, and like looking at it from the perspective of Palestine and what's happening. What do you have to say about this thing that like human rights are, or this framework is just universal and it's an answer to everything, all our problems, or the
Yeah.
best is available to us?
Yeah, thank you, Rabia. I think to answer that, I would actually like to build upon something very important that John mentioned with regards to like the regime, the international human rights regime that we all live under, and that we, to a great extent, it became part of our common sense, like in ways that are extraordinary. So it seems to me that a lot of people in their everyday life who may not even be terribly political, but they have this assumption at the back of their mind, or they have been given this assumption in recent decades that if things were to get too bad for you, potentially, there is a system in place, there is a regime which will at some point come into action, and that you do have certain rights that will be protected and asserted. And that is why in a lot of conflicts you find this footage of people saying, where are the international organizations? Where are the international powers? What about my rights? It's because there's this underlying assumption that something out there is this system, imperfect as it is, but there will be a cavalry that will perhaps come for you at some point once things go beyond a certain level in terms of violence or criminality against you. The problem with all of this is, and I think this is something that we need to have more discussions where people begin to understand the architecture of like this whole international human rights regime, on the basis of which not just you and I who work in the media, the academia, or the rights sector, or the development sector, but so many ordinary people built their whole assumptions, their worldview, their hopes and aspirations around the existence of such a international human rights regime somewhere out there. I think it's not fully understood by a lot of the mainstream how contingent it all is, what a product of history it all is. As John said, it's basically a post-1945 thing. Now, we need to emphasize this because international human rights law makes some very, very extraordinary claims in the domain of international law. It also claims the right or the necessity of steamrolling certain norms of international law that were widely accepted before, let's say, this regime came into being in the post-1945, right? So some extraordinary claims are made essentially about the fact that there are some hard limits to, for instance, the exercise are not allowed to assert your sovereignty when it comes at the cost of the individual. And so the individual has also been inserted,
Exactly.
right, into the international human rights sort of discourse. Now, there's an interesting philosophical debate to be had about that. I will not go into that. There's an interesting legal debate. I will not go into that. I will try not to bore our audience with monistic and dualistic conceptions of international human rights law and the regime. But what I can say is the following, and I think this is the most important thing, so a lot of the assumptions of international human rights law and the regime that we are told exists internationally are based on the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials of war criminals from the Axis powers, right? And certain norms emerged from those and from subsequent, discussions, including the UN General Assembly and so on. There are certain norms which are considered peremptory, which, to put it in everyday language, are so basic, so fundamental, that there is no need to even have to assert them all the time. They are so obvious, so basic, so fundamental, that any law that you pass, even in any country, even domestically, cannot possibly go against those norms, right? They are such basic, certain norms held to be so basic by this international human rights regime. And then there are two kinds of countries: those that automatically accept that there is only one legal regime, which is the international one, and their domestic law has to sort of be in harmony with that. And the other conception is that even if it's not in harmony, you are required to, through a domestic procedure, to amend your laws and so on and so forth, and bring it in line with that. What I'm trying to say is that this extraordinary claims that have been made, the culmination of all of this was supposed to be also, for example, with the International Court of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. We've heard a lot about it recently because they have essentially called for it's supposed to try Israeli leaders. They also mentioned certain Palestinian resistance leaders, but the main point being that they were supposed to act. Now, the problem with the ICC, and this is where this should be a reflection of what we're saying about the whole international human rights regime, is we actually have two case studies within the last 4 years or 5 years of how the international human rights regime and its greatest defenders and the rules-based order and its protectors actually operate. So they say one set of things from the war in Ukraine and a completely different set of things, you see, when it comes to Palestine, Gaza, and to Lebanon. And these things are not mutually reconcilable. I remember so many of my European liberal friends telling me when Russia got involved in Ukraine, they were like, we cannot go back to that old world, that world of Bismarck, that world of great power politics and balance of power and so on and so forth. No longer can we go back to that 19th century world. We have to move forward. There are some international norms. You cannot do this, you cannot do that. Okay. But then I would like to ask them now. I wish I could ask them, what world have we gone back to now since the 7th of October 2023? It would seem it's further back than the 19th century, further back than the time of Bismarck. I mean, if you look at Netanyahu's rhetoric, it seems we've gone back to some biblical Hebrew Bible era, where with all this talk of annihilating Amalek and all of that. What I'm trying to say is essentially that the international human rights regime has been sabotaged systematically by the very people who used it first, including to invade countries and to have wars, like in Yugoslavia, in being one example in 1999. So it's not, the existence of this human rights law regime is not just a bunch of nice noble principles. It's been used for war before, and today you find that being systematically sabotaged. Just before I conclude, the ICC, which is based on the Rome Treaty, a lot of European countries have ratified that. The United States and Israel, for instance, have not. The reason I mention this is because instead of acceding to that and binding themselves by some kind of rules-based order, the US actually has this thing colloquially called the Hague Invasion Act. And I would urge anyone who's listening to this to Google that. What it essentially allows them to do is to take any sort of action to burst out of jail in The Hague anyone, not just from the US armed forces, but from the armed forces of their allies, which could be anyone. It could be Israel, it could be, I don't know, Taiwan, it could be anything. And so this is where we stand. So I think it's very important for people to understand where that international human rights regime came from, to understand its limitations.
If I may interject quickly, Rabia.
Please do.
So this is the point. We had in the post-1945 world determined by the UN Charter, a system of sovereign of states, all of whom were sovereign and equal to one another. Upon that was built on top of that was a human rights regime which abbreviated their sovereignty of each of them under a super sovereign who determined what human rights violations were in each particular place and thereby license themselves to interfere. You have had dozens upon dozens of regime change operations, many of which are justified subsequently as being based on concern about human rights. And so there is a particular role that language plays in international order. Again, I'm not saying that there are not good moral impulses behind it and that we don't need international law. But the language of human rights, that is to say, from a deeper perspective, a historical perspective, is grounded in something that is actually not so easy to set aside as what we're seeing today. It is grounded in an ontology of natural law, an ontology in which there is a God, a creator, and so on. You ditch all that, you decapitate the thing, and then you have these assertions by fiat, which can be turned over and switched around. So it's not, what we have today, as a friend of mine, a good friend of mine said, isn't hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. That's what the human rights regime has in effect worked out as. And many of us have been played by it. Okay, we've gone along with it, but I think we feel played by the system as a whole when we see it fail, not just disastrously, but systematically and quite deliberately in the case of what's happening in Palestine.
Yes, and Palestine is sort of exposed these, if, like hypocrisy or hierarchies are you're calling them, and it's kind of like brought this conversation forward as well, things which we did not want to speak about. We were afraid to touch upon previously, right? No one was going to say anything to like say much about the international human rights frameworks or law and its effectiveness, because thinking that this is all that we have, but technically, this is what we have at the moment, and how to basically go forward from there. What can we do, without getting into like what is the problem at hand, what can be done? Because you are confronted with these like really strong blocks who can go into the United Nations Security Council and veto a ceasefire resolution, which sounds like something at sometimes very strong as something which is like, oh, this is effective, and yet it can happen, and yet there can't be any ceasefire on the ground. A resolution can be passed, even with all the problems of language, even when they have been passed, like a temporary humanitarian pause or something, and it hasn't been effective at all, because the bombing hasn't stopped. Let's just stick to facts for now. So what can we do? And that's where the role of China or other countries or the ASEAN countries or countries which are not from those blocks come in. Because please, this is my question to both of you.
Yeah, please go ahead. I actually have, I'm hoping to add to that question for both of you. I know it's sort of like passing the ball around, but what I'm trying to say is that you've both worked in various capacities with, the system as it was. And I think there's also some sort of consensus that we do need certain universal values and so on and so forth and standards. We cannot just throw them all out just because, as you say, there is a hierarchy and not hypocrisy, right? So I guess what we need to be talking about as well, all over the world, especially in the global south, is on what grounds, on what basis should we begin to imagine a new situation? Can we even speak about a new regime, perhaps, for human rights, for universal values? And then what to do about the fact that it would clash quite dramatically with the existing framework. As a small example, Rabia mentioned, for instance, South Africa. She mentioned China. Now, the Chinese position, for instance, on this conflict is quite different from the standard Western position. So the Chinese representative actually cited a body of international human rights law, which emerges from the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. And he then went on to say that essentially that there is a certain right to armed resistance for a project of national self-determination, such as the one in Palestine. And this is extraordinary. This is very different from how this is conceived, for instance, in in a lot of the NATO countries. So there is already a very different conception of what universal values and human rights actually mean. So I'm hoping that both you, John, and Rabia perhaps as well, could sort of point to what building blocks and what institutions can we rely upon or hope to build if they don't exist, which could actually be more reflective of the things, for example, that John has spoken about in terms of the many civilizational and philosophical views of the majority of the world, and not just the global north.
Right.
John, perhaps?
I would say, those rights or that human value, the sanctity of life. I think even the human rights doctrine is supposed to assert this. They're there. You don't have to be able to talk about it in exactly the same way. They are just there. But that's that's almost a theological assertion. That's an assertion about the world, and it has the form almost in many traditions of a theological assertion, because it's just there. This is the ground level truth. But we find that it has become subordinate to, the discourse of security. So if you offend the security of certain people, then anything can be done to you. A hospital happens to be sort of contaminated at some point by quote unquote terrorists, then we can then you are licensed to bomb the hospital. So obviously it's failing. And these institutions that we've come to, as Ziyad said, rightly come to think of as being the backstop, actually can do nothing about it. These human rights organizations, if they're not complicit in this, are helpless. The international courts, while they're important in marking what's happening for perhaps another time for posterity, they can't do anything. It's really, the thing that we can't escape is you needed sovereignty. Rights were given in a national context. If you assert a right just like that out of the blue and you don't talk about who's going to guarantee those rights, who's going to protect those rights, you are making a theological assertion. And if you make a theological assertion in a vacuum, then I'm not going to expect you to hold to anything. It's different if a Muslim says this in faith or a Christian says this. Okay, there is a tradition, there is a community, there is a deep commitment to whatever that assertion is. But if you're just making that in a vacuum and you use that to abbreviate and truncate the state, the sovereignty that is actually the only guarantor we have right now for the rights, for the protection of many people, then you're not seeing where the solution might come, where the protection of these people might come from. Now we turn to states. And now we're talking about whether China, ASEAN can do anything, because you're looking at where you need power. You need sovereign power to intervene at some level. And that's really difficult to achieve, but at least we're getting somewhere real now. Okay. If you want to talk about China's perspective as being different, of course it's different. China is part of the third world. In fact, the idea of a third world emerged from there. So, of course, it has the perspective of a nation that was almost colonized, that was in fact in bits and pieces semi-colonized by 7 or 8 imperial powers. So, and in great danger of dismemberment. So, it's from that experience that China sort of evaluates this, but it's not unique to China, of course. All the nations of the global South share that experience. And by the way, that insistence on sovereignty. They protect their sovereignty against this because that's the only thing that's going to save them in this circumstance. This is not to say that nations don't bully their own people, don't do terrible things, etc. But what else do you have in the international space right now? You clearly have, we are left with a challenge, with an awful contradiction of everything that we said we stood for. We thought that there was a world in which there might be some notion of law. And clearly that's not enough. That's being violated, and this by the and in a way that's supposed to be consistent with the rules-based international order. So I think that's where we are right now. And how do we sort of do something about the situation? It has to come through international action.
Okay.
Right. You mentioned ASEAN. ASEAN has been able to do almost, very, very little. Of course. I mean, these are matters of life and death and in geopolitics, and there are larger calculations, but no one has been able to do anything or even fulfill, except Yemen, right? And Hezbollah and Lebanon. No one has fulfilled the duty, actually, to do something about a situation like this, and that's a duty enshrined in an obligation in human rights law.
Yes, and also just sort of I wouldn't say inability, but it's deliberate of
Yeah.
the OIC as well. We can't not talk about the the Arab and Islamic countries who had like a meeting upon meeting on this issue and come forward with like some sort of a statement, and then they have have proven to be absolutely useless. I mean, Ziyad offline, we've had
Yes.
these, and he's spoken about limitations of powerful Arab countries as well. And the most people think we've achieved from this and what's happened is that there might not be normalization, from the Arab countries. Saudi's normalization process with Israel, which had started, and that's the only thing. But like Pakistan does not recognize Israel. There are one or two other countries that don't recognize Israel. That's the maximum, right? That
Malaysia too, as
Mal-
well, right?
Yeah.
And
Malaysia does not.
but then there you have the UAE and others who have a relationship, and Bahrain, and so that's that. Speaking of like the question that Ziyad had put forward, like had sort of directed towards me when I had asked both of you to sort of think through some of the things that I am thinking through, and I'm unable to find an answer of, like, but John has said that it's like a contradiction we are faced with, and I call it a dead end. So we have our own like ways of thinking about it. Like, how do you see beyond that? Because I'm exhausted after like seeing a number of journalists being killed, and like statements, humanitarian workers, doctors, lawyers, people, basically, and all of the organizations that work on these specific issues, like, organizations that work on journalist rights, people, organizations that work for humanitarian workers, and X and Y and Z and child rights and women's rights and everything. And they are, like you're saying, there is complicity. There are women's rights organizations and reproductive health rights organizations and like feminist collectives in the West who are silent, on these issues, and yet those who are not silent have also not been able to do much. But thinking of like, how can we campaign more? What can we do? Maybe we are going to be unable to do anything when it comes to Gaza, but otherwise, right? How do we move from that? We can't like keep operating in the same way that we were. I think if the sector, at large, if there is like one human rights sector, I mean, just sort of limiting it, if they want to, survive and exist, they can't keep operating the same way. And I think they know that. And if no one's speaking about it or not like speaking about it publicly, this is dishonest. A lot of it is also driven by where the money is coming from, where the influence is coming from, again, power when it comes to like human rights work and humanitarian work as well. So we are limited to that as well. But I think we have to speak to each other more. And that might be a very simplified answer, but we have to also look towards each other and for solutions and sort of for campaignings and for movement, because we have to, by the end of the day, we can't not hold. I mean, sovereignty and those things are important, but we have to hold our own governments accountable, right? Because there are problems you can't say like there is no problem in Pakistan, there's no problem in India, or, Sri Lanka for that matter, or Indonesia or elsewhere. There are some real glaring problems in our countries, and it's not just about like the rights of like minorities, or it's a labor rights issue and XYZ. So I think we have to look more towards each other instead of looking towards the West, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and how do we build on that momentum and sort of move from here? So that's I don't have an answer to that, right?
No, I think you
No,
framed
I
the
think you
question
framed
very,
the
very
question
well.
very, very well.
I think, I don't want to be to give the impression. I just now I described a very, very grim situation. It seems as if we have this international anarchy, like the realists in IR theory, people like Mearsheimer like to say, okay, you have anarchy, you only have these nations, and only they are the actors, and the international space is ungovernable. But you cannot have, see what's going on now with the Zionist entity and the center of this is a true sort of revelation of the meaning of the international order we're in. It's absolutely consistent with that order. That's the remarkable thing. This is not an aberration, right? This is not this is not a bug. This is the feature of that order, and that's, to me, is how ugly it is. So then we then need to think about the international order. It's not too far away a thought to understand now that where we are today, if we want to secure human life, welfare, flourishing, justice in our own countries, we also need to think about the international order, because these things are related. That's why the meetings such as the one that's going on in Kazan, at the BRICS meeting, for example, these things are really important. Because the solution isn't going, obviously, there's not going to be some sort of instant arm intervention into this. You need a global order in which barbarism like this is banished forever. And that begins with the hard work of some of these regional organizations, which may seem boring, but I think they have a revolutionary implication in the longer term. So yes, that's the context in which I think we need to talk to one another more, which is why I appreciate this conversation. This is sort of a South-South conversation. It's a different one than would be had if we imagined ourselves sort of under some, having to bow and scrape before certain concepts already. No, we don't. We're liberated from those. To me,
Yeah.
I mean, what we're seeing today, Palestine, it's the graveyard of the liberal order, and indeed the graveyard of liberalism. People are going to look back on this, on liberal values. I think it goes as deep as that. But we need to think about what our quote unquote values are. How we defend these things, and we need to come. It's not for one person, one country to impose on another, which is to say that the dialogue becomes civilizational.
Okay. I'm thinking of what you've said in terms of like the South-South conversation and looking towards each other. I'm also like thinking of it in terms of how various organizations and just declare a country closed or a country repressed, because they have certain criterias of when it comes to human rights violations or abuses, or where state excesses lie. And then a country can be declared closed by one international human rights organization. And that just kind of like builds this image of a place which is completely inaccessible, and it's fully like closed, and as if nothing exists. And if people are just like standing up for rights, then the mainstream media in the West would report on that as if like this is sort of how crazy and not crazy, but just like horrifyingly closed that country is, how dangerous it is to be a person in a country Y or C for that matter. And then that also stops us from engaging with each other on these issues, right? And I'm thinking of
Absolutely.
how, yeah, and when it comes to like rethinking frameworks, maybe that's also why we need to speak to each other, so that our reference points are not just those which are being dictated by rights organizations, which I think have well-meaning people and have a good agenda as well, but they're based in the West and are being a lot of what they speak about is also being dictated by the West, if I can, if I can call it.
Solutions in search of a problem.
Yeah. So solution is probably yes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying, because the existing framework, to summarize it, I mean, because we earlier mentioned the ICC. Well, the prosecutor there said that, a senior Western leader told him that this whole thing was actually not designed to deal with the existing situation. It was designed, and I quote, it was designed for African dictators and thugs like Putin. Those were the words, and
Yes.
they've been
That
reported upon,
Absolutely.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So clearly, one cannot look towards that sort of thing for some kind of way out. But I find it very interesting, because of what John said with, for example, the discussions going on in Kazan and so on. So what I'm wondering, and I'm hoping that the two of you could help me think through this, perhaps, is, can we consider realistically the possibility then of, perhaps, because there are already new regionalisms emerging. I mean, and I mean, ASEAN is one of those. BRICS is a much broader, now much more ambitious kind of uh, uh, thing. And there are these blocks, for example, in Latin America. A lot of the discussion is driven by regional blocks and so on. In Africa, I think that is the case too. Although perhaps it seems to me that perhaps the most effective blocks seem to be those emerging in Latin America, um, at least on these issues. In terms of, by effectiveness, I just mean in terms of how much they've been actually able to get done in terms of building a regime, or which is essentially a South American one, even for human rights and for cultural rights and indigenous rights and so on and so forth. This is my impression. It could be wrong.
Yep.
What I want to ask the two of you is whether it is realistic to hope for such sort of regional standards that are cross-country to emerge also from organizations such as the BRICS, or from ASEAN, or from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on. Is it realistic to imagine that conversations might go there as well, beyond economic cooperation or strategic cooperation?
I think that's a great challenge. In ASEAN, for example, has often been accused of not talking enough about human rights. But actually, if we were to discuss, and ASEAN is a lot of conversations, a lot of talking going on, because it's not a supranational organization, with a hierarchy, a set of, it's a consensual and kind of association. So they align themselves and coordinate by talking to one another. They arrive at consensus through talking. There are efforts to talk about, there is a kind of caucus on human rights and so on. But actually, the challenge is to really take the conversation a step further and talk about it in our own terms, in our own conceptual and language, if you will. Because actually putting it in, just keeping it to human rights actually is not us talking, it's being talked to. It's having well-meaning people from human rights organizations and all that come and talk to us. So I understand Ziyad's concern. Is it going to be sort of a world of these regional conversations? Well, actually, there's no conversation going on right now. You just have these things given to you, and if you're educated in the liberal West, you just adopt them. It's not really a
Right.
conversation. The challenge is to do it in a different way and actually have these conversations. And we have no choice. We're no longer in the sort of, in the 12th century or something where it's globalized. We're interacting with one another. And yet we have these this cultural diversity that now has its moment to really assert itself, and people need then to talk to one another. And what emerges has to be a product of that conversation, and you need to cultivate the arts of conversation and the mechanisms, the institutions for it. So it's a big project. It's probably a generational project, but it has to happen because, for example, if BRICS grows and as BRICS grows stronger, and that kind of multilateralism becomes dominant and starts to define the world order, you're going to need a lot more of these kinds of conversation, because it's not going to be about some hegemon imposing its value scheme on others as a sort of a hierarchy, right? Human rights talk and democracy talk is what in the colonial era was civilization talk. So you have it in particular degrees, and I confer it on you. Maybe you are semi-civilized, according to the color of your skin or whatever, right? And you have sovereignty you need to be tutored, right? If you are lower down the chain, and you have sovereignty in proportion to your degree of civilization. So it serves that sort of function, human rights and democracy talk, and it serves also to divide people, as Rabia just reminded us. Oh, certain nations are closed off. You can't talk to people in this country because they're off beyond the pale. Their leader is another, Hitler. This is just infantile. Yeah, try talking to those people. Yeah.
Yeah, and also just sort of this was, of course, but I agree with John that it's has to be, if this project begins, it's going to be a generational project maybe, because that just doesn't exist at the moment. Maybe informally, collectives do talk to each other, for like we are speaking with each other, and there are people who do. It's not very organized, I believe. But I'm thinking of how in our own countries, we have been unable to, looking at the international rights frameworks and all, unable to convince people, various stakeholders for that matter, not just governments, but various actors of like not to do, XYZ, not to commit this act of violence, not to do this, because the very answer that they have is that this is Western, So we also we've been talking about how we need to rethink certain problems and sort of speak to people how, like you've said, like, things in our tradition, for instance, in Islam or in Christianity, for that matter, which these concepts, these rights, they exist already. We have a language for them. It's just that our
Yes.
states have not developed them and not studied. It's just that we are, we're trained in a certain be it like in the West or secular traditions, not disagreeing with them, but we are not taught those, right? In schools or elsewhere. I don't know about other countries, but I'm thinking of Pakistan at the moment. And so we've been thinking of how to like think through a campaign X, how to campaign on rights of equality of all citizens, and how to save uh, people from violence in the name of religion, for that matter, because it's a big thing. This thing, how to speak about women's rights, and not have it be branded as something which has come from the West. So
Yeah.
just think of that. So just like we need to think through these issues in our countries, we also have to maybe can look towards each other and learn from each other. And I feel like it'll have to be a redefining of what we mean by human rights. It's just that
Yep.
there is this sort of like impression created that when these countries would speak about human rights, they'll be like universal. They would not think of universal concepts, and they will be like, and they just want to, and these governments just want to not be able to, provide rights to people. So so there are these like fears, around these conversations.
It's as
But
if before 1945, none of us knew, for the thousands of years of human civilization, none of us knew how to protect widows, feed the hungry, right? Care for the orphans, protect life, bar the murder of innocents, as if we didn't know how to do these things
live in harmony
without
with
that
each other.
language. It's as if these things were not maintained. Human rights language has a particular philosophical genealogy. It comes out of a particular tradition, but denatured and taken out of its original context, and it's become a sort of table thumping exercise, which doesn't quite work, right? So, these people have these rights, but then, those rights are trumped by my, right to feel safe, for example. So you don't have a larger sort of ontology. So what you have is the project of liberal power. Now, it's a harder and it's a civilizational task to type, rebuild, retrieve, reinvent ourselves with deeper sets of, with a deeper vocabulary for protecting, for justice, right? For the sanctity of life, for example. But it has to be done. Yeah, I agree. It's difficult. I understand these concerns, right? I come from a Muslim majority country, for example, right? But I also, in that context, understand the importance of speaking these things actually in Islamic terms as well. And I find really interesting dialogues, philosophical dialogues with Muslim thinkers. So this sort of thing, I think, it needs to be done. It's difficult, but yeah, that discussion is really important.
Yes. John, thank you so much for speaking with us. And it feels like, as useful as this was, it feels like an incomplete conversation, because we have to have a part 2 and part 3 of this.
We didn't get to the China part.
Yes, we
Yeah.
didn't get to the China part in detail, but I think that's a specifically, we need to have another one on China. And
Thank you.
yes, and Ziyad, any last words before we say Khudafis to our viewers?
Yeah, I didn't expect to have last words on this. Having said that, yeah, I mean, as you say, this is a generational and a civilizational project. Yeah, so I don't expect to have the last word on it. Not today, at any rate.
Well said.
You,
Well said.
you don't want to
No, he got out of that very elegantly.
yes, he did. He did. Yes. Thank you to both our guests and to our viewers for watching. And Khudafis.